Yes, the mic is on right now. Yes, of course. In fact, I'm going to start with,
like minimize it from here.
Actually, I want to move it down. Can I just move? Oh, that doesn't move down because this is not a Mac. You want to minimize it?
Yes.
Yes, so let me.
You want to play a video?
I'm going to play a video right now as the beginning.
Video.
No, you need adjustments for it?
Yes.
No, then I'm not going to play a video. I don't want to have to mess around. And this, it goes here.
Yes, press F5.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, good. Okay, can we start? Yes, sir. Okay, good morning, everybody. Is the sound okay or is it too loud? I can hear an echo. Can we change that? There's a very strong echo. So my lecture for today actually is called Planning and the Modern City, or you can actually call it the City of Modernity, if you will. It is another way, if you will, of telling the history of planning. I have shown you one in which I specifically talked about if you were to tell the history of the planning as the history of urban form. This one is more a focus of or about if you were to tell the history of planning in terms of how the actions of planners and the residents' reaction to them were actually captured by writers. So that is basically the method that I'm using for this one. And what I'm trying to do is in every single lecture show you a different way by which the history of planning can be narrated. So we're going to talk about the modern, a word that we all use quite often, and whose meaning we all seem to know in one way or another. But it's actually quite sophisticated. What is this word? Is it a moment? Is it a particular point in history? Is it a style? Is it a process? Is it a feeling? Is it somewhere else? Is it America or Europe or the first world? What I'm going to try to do is to almost tease out ways in which this very specific word contains very legible notions of the urban, of urbanization, of urbanism, and hence of planning. The term itself, of course, is not an old term. It did not exist, for example, in the 16th century or the 17th century. And I want to start by a very classic painting. In this case by Gustave Caillebotte, a French painter who lived mainly in the 19th century. He died at the end of the 19th century, was a member of the Impressionists, even though, unlike many of the Impressionists, he was also very interested in photography. Believe it or not, this is actually a painting of his, which was one of the first paintings ever produced as a painting based on a photograph representing a Paris day in the 1860s and 1870s. What is very interesting about it from my perspective is it does capture this very specific moment of what modernity is all about. People out, if you will, in the streets. And it is then something that becomes really important. From this, I'm going to leave this out here, just as a particular image from the 1860s, from the time Paris was being remade. And I'm going to read for you a passage that comes from a very famous French poet. It's a poem in French, translated to English in this case. So bear with me as I read it. Ah, you would like to know why I hate you today. It will no doubt be harder for you to understand than for me to explain, as you are, I believe, the most perfect example of feminine impermeability that one could encounter. We had just passed a long day together that appeared short to me. We had each sworn that our thoughts would become to both of us like one, and that our two souls would never more do anything but as one. A dream that has nothing original in it after all, except that it has been dreamt by many and realized by none. That evening, a bit tired, you wanted to sit down in front of a new cafe on the corner of a new boulevard, still covered with rubble, but already showing glorious its unfinished splendor. The cafe sparkled with light. The gas lamps themselves radiated all the warmth of a new day, and with their strength brightened and blinding white walls, the dazzling faces and mirrors, the gilded moldings and cornices, the errand boys with their chubby cheeks trailing behind their leashed dogs, the ladies laughing at the falcons perched on their fists, carrying on their heads fruits, pâté, an amphora of Bavarian cream, or a selection of colored ice. All history and all mythology put in the service of gluttony. Just in front of us on the roadway was planted a brave man of some 40-some years with a weary face, a grizzled beard, holding the hand of a little boy and carrying in his other arm a small child too weak to walk. He was playing nanny and taking his children out for some evening air, all in rags. These three faces were extraordinarily serious, and their 6 eyes contemplated the new cafe with equal admiration, though varying in expression according to age. The eyes of the father were saying, "How beautiful it is, how beautiful it is. One might say that all the gold of our poor world is painted on these walls." The eyes of the little boy, "How beautiful it is, how beautiful it is. But this is a house that only grants entry to people who are not like us." For the eyes of the smallest, they were too fascinated to express anything but mindless and profound joy. They say that pleasure lifts the spirit and softens the heart. They were right that evening concerning me. Not only was I touched by that family of eyes, as I felt a little ashamed of our glasses and our carafes, much larger than our thirst. I turned my gaze towards you, dear love, to read my thoughts there. I was plunging my eyes into your eyes, so beautiful, so oddly gentle, into your green eyes inhabited by Capris and inspired by the moon, when you said to me, "Those people, they are insufferable, with their eyes open like carriage gates. Could you not ask the maitre d' to send them away from here, from in front of us?" How difficult it is to understand each other, my dear angel, and how much thought is incommunicable, even between people who love each other. Anyone can guess who this is? This is Charles Baudelaire, one of France's most famous poets, writing in the mid-19th century at a time that is absolutely crucial, both for the history of France itself, because the French Revolution had happened already 50, 60 years earlier, but also at a time when Paris as a city is being remade, and for the first time where planning is completely reshaping an entire city. Although the rise of the city, if you will, in the 20th century, and I'm actually showing you here Charles Baudelaire's Paris Spleen, that is the anthology from which I read. The rise of the city in the 20th century is closely allied with the experience of modernity. Many theorists have distinguished between the experience of urban modernity and the larger processes of modernization, as I alluded to earlier in one of my lectures, and I will come back to this a bit later. In these accounts, the experience of modernity is often based, if you will, on the notion of encounter. And Baudelaire's encounter in the context of what Baron Haussmann actually did in the replanning of Paris becomes very, very important for us to understand. The sociologist Georges Simmel was among the first to theorize the relationship between the individual and the modern city. In fact, in a piece that I have also assigned to you if you had a chance to look at it. Simmel, in a piece that was actually written in Germany way back at the beginning of the century, was in a very unique position to be able to judge this and actually to talk about it, because he had witnessed the city, which we talk about as sort of the industrial city, being transformed, if you will, into the modern city. So in a famous piece written in 1903, 114 years ago, called The Metropolis and Mental Life, he identified the city in terms of its urban personality, which he believed was markedly different than that of the small town and of rural life. He identifies, in fact, 7 traits of what he calls the urbanite. This is the person who lives in a city and has a certain urban personality, you will. An imaginary person. In fact, he comes up with this person whom he calls Hans. Again, a Germanic name in a sense to fit. And Hans is precisely this character who moves around the city, trying to understand it, to digest it, yet at the same time, Hans comes from a very specific background, as I was talking about in the industrial city, his rural background before, his upbringing, the set of traditional values he may have had before all of this exposure. Hans, in a sense, becomes a flaneur. That's a term, an important term, but it's one that is fundamental for the understanding of modernity. It's a French term, and a flaneur, in this case, is the person who goes wandering about the city with a very specific gaze. So it's the gaze of the individual who's engaged in discovery. There's quite a lot of work that is done on the flaneur, to the point that now we have a discipline called flaneurism. And again, the flaneur in this case is a male gaze. It's not just simply an ordinary gaze. Marshall Berman, in the book that is called All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, that I told you about earlier, uses Baudelaire very beautifully to describe the city, to describe what the city does, what the city says to them. And Simmel, in basically talking about, in this case, in talking about Hans, talks about the kinds of things that Hans encounters. So he encounters first an excess of sensory stimuli, against which, in fact, he has to develop an attitude. So Simmel tells us he develops what he calls a blasé attitude, an incapacity, in a sense, to almost react to what one sees, and one becomes numb a bit to it. In addition to acquiring this blasé attitude towards society at large, Hans's relationship to his work is also reduced, in a sense, to issues of quantity, a lot more than quality. Quality does count, but it has to do more with how much time does he spend, how many products does he produce. In his relationship with his employers, he would also experience impersonality, due mainly to the idea that everything now has been reduced to monetary exchange, unlike what he used to have back in the village. Outside work, in this case, he would turn into almost a consumer of mass spectacle and of consumption. Han would attain skills of rational calculation. Everything he engages in has to be rationalized, because he knows it may not necessarily pay off unless it's that rational. He would start experiencing time as schedule and space as a construct. It's a beautiful statement from Berman. Experiencing time as schedule and space as a construct. Yet, against all of these disorienting developments, Hans would still be freed in the city, and I'm sure many of you would even understand that, from the restrictions, if you will, of the tightly knit community which he had actually had back in his village, and in this case in his Bavarian village. This last factor then would enable him to develop his individuality. In Simmel's model, reactions were determined by intellect and calculation rather than by intuition and feeling. You exist in the city, and this is what the city forces you to be. Driven by intellect and protecting himself with a blasé attitude, the modern big city then resident becomes indifferent to genuine individuality. That doesn't really matter anymore. Mind you, this is Simmel writing 100 and some years ago. What fascinates me is how is it that what he's saying right now actually applies to many situations in the third world today, not back in 1903 when he wrote that. So a fundamental part of this project of modernity has involved the reconstruction of cities. Baudelaire's days witnessed the opening of the great boulevards of Paris, precisely by the likes of Baron Haussmann that we have someone like Baudelaire actually talking about here. Why? Because Paris was this very concentrated city. It had an old medieval core. It had already existed for 1,000 years. It was very difficult to move into it. Quite a lot of things actually happened in Paris in the 1840s and 1850s that are akin to a revolution. Paris establishes what is called the Paris Commune. Paris becomes independent from the rest of France. This is the time in which ideas of socialism are spreading. Individuals are asking for their rights and are unwilling to accept the monarchy anymore. So during that time, in fact, as you probably know, France was a kingdom. Then it ceases to be a kingdom, it becomes a republic, then it becomes a kingdom again, and then it becomes a republic, and then ultimately you end up with the Third Republic, which is what you have in France today. This actually happened as a result of a specific urban program. So following work by theorists like Walter Benjamin, and in fact using a Marxist lens to analyze this, Marshall Berman, in that same book that I told you about, also uses the eyes of the poor, this thing that Baudelaire just wrote, to suggest that the experience of modernity emerged from destruction that was brought on in a top-down modernization process, a planning process that was so top-down in which individuals almost did not exist within it. And of course, here, while one of the lovers wants the poor removed from her sight, the other lover is so embarrassed and almost engulfed in shame about that feeling. And it's this specific human interaction that makes for what is often called the angst of modernity. This notion that this change does not come without a price, and that the price that it comes with is often so excessive that some people cannot necessarily, if you will, bear it. In Berman's account, the boulevards were paradigmatic sites of modernity that, among other things, created private spaces in a public view. Now, this is new. Why? Because in the context of Paris, what you had is you had a very dense, dingy city made of very cavernous streets, exactly like what you actually see often in the walled city of Amritsar or any of the other cities here in India, the older cities in India, inhabited principally by poor people. The rich have moved out. They live elsewhere. They sometimes visit certain sites to get something out of it, but that's it. So you come in and you carve major boulevards in the old city, and suddenly, in the process of doing so, new activities emerge. Some of the rich come back to benefit from the centrality of the city, and the poor, for the first time, have the capacity to encounter the rich on these streets that have been created through planning interventions of modernity. That's what Berman is very interested in. So, in a sense, to understand this specific experience of modernity, we have to understand the backdrop of modernization. Baudelaire's Paris was also the Paris of Baron Haussmann. What I'm actually showing you a map of the city here. In a sense, literally before Haussmann's intervention. I will talk briefly actually about that as I get more into this. French colonization of North Africa and of parts of Africa had already started during that time. So Algeria, for example, was already colonized. And that connection is something I will actually come to in my lecture on colonialism later today. Haussmann gets appointed in 1860 as the commissioner of Paris and is given unprecedented powers by Napoleon III. Again, that's not Napoleon Bonaparte. Why? Because again, as I just told you, France has gone through this very weird process. So France has a revolution. It's no longer a kingdom or an empire. It becomes a republic. And then as a result of it being a republic, Napoleon becomes emperor again. He becomes president who declares himself an empire. And as a result, his great-grandson, Napoleon III, comes in and gives to Baron Haussmann this responsibility. Change the city. The idea here was to create a modern city that is fit for capitalism and free of all of the kind of socialist challenges that was starting to occur in Europe at the time. To understand the impetus of Baron Haussmann's actions, it is important to bear in mind that since 1789, since the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille prison, Paris had developed as the seething site of all revolutionary activity in Europe. In 1848, in the middle of the century, citizens of Paris, artisans, craftsmen, shopkeepers, poets, socialists, all took to the streets, erected barricades, presenting a revolutionary challenge to capitalism. The barricades of 1848 were eventually smashed, and by 1852, the Second Empire came to existence again, and the First Republic, if you will, died, creating an authoritarian state with police power, just like many of the states that exist in the world today. So Haussmann takes office, and Napoleon III handed him a map of Paris in which he had sketched on it, that's the emperor himself, new patterns and roads that he wanted to build. With unquestioned and unparalleled institutional power, Haussmann sets out to literally cut open and reconstruct the physical fabric of the city, as you can actually see here in the map. The idea was, this is a city with all of these very difficult roads in it. Everything is basically curved and intertwined, so on and so forth. And the notion was, let's just connect the important parts of the city through these straight roads that would require cutting through the urban fabric of the city, and in a sense would require quite a lot of demolition, if you will, in the process. The core of Haussmann's plan for New Paris was a system of boulevards. In fact, 90 miles in a city that basically, when you look at it from end to end, we're actually talking here about no more than 5 kilometers. Yet, within it, you can create 90 miles, which is 110 kilometers or so, of new roads. The building of these boulevards was supposed to serve many new functions, planning at its best. They were to facilitate traffic and allow for the efficient circulation of goods and people, an absolute prerequisite for the emerging commercial interests within the city. They were to allow for easy deployment of troops against barricading workers. Remember, because they had barricaded themselves, and they managed to almost make Paris a separate city from the rest of France. So, now we want to make sure that the army can march in and kill those people immediately if they ever rebel again. The boulevards were to also destroy the slums. Remember, I talked about the slums yesterday, that clustered in the heart of the city, and to also raise property values to new gentrified areas. In a sense, almost a reminder that this notion of gentrification that exists in all cities today owes its origin to this very specific time. Now, if you don't know what gentrification is, I'll just give you a very brief definition of it. It is the transformation of real estate from low-end value to high-end users, often involving the displacement of the poor people who live in those areas. So you come to an area, you know that this area, the land is really valuable, but why is it that it has those people who are living in slum-like conditions? Well, let's remove the slums and let's relocate those people and let's put proper functions, if you will, proper in quotes there. So Haussmann reorganizes, he actually establishes a company that had some financial power to develop, build, own, and manage all of these spaces that he was going to take over. In 1840, 50% of Parisian property, in fact, which is very interesting when you think about how the actions of planning, 50% of all Parisian property, all properties that existed in the city of Paris in 1840s, in fact in 1846, before he started, was dominated mainly by shopkeepers and artisans. Smaller folks, whom we would actually call the middle class. By 1880, which is almost 35 years or so after he was done with his entire project, this number had dropped to only 6%. 6%. Why? Because now you had new corporations, you had wealthy individuals who don't even live in the city, who managed to acquire much of the new property and became landlords as a result of the displacement of these people. One of the other objectives of Haussmann's plan was that the boulevards were supposed to afford a sense of monumental urban scale, of broad pathways, imposing vistas. This was the city that was, after all, supposed to host the first serious world exhibition the Exposition Universelle. And it was supposed to become, if you will, popular at the time. So in a sense, you can understand that Calibo's painting that I just showed you, produced from that time, or Berman's poem talking about this very specific encounter. This is the Paris that was being created by Baron Haussmann. Finally, the construction of the boulevard was also supposed to serve as a public works program, not only involving massive state investment in the built environment, but also putting to work a very large number of unemployed workers. From an economic perspective, this becomes very important because this is, as we later discover in the development of economics, it's a Keynesian perspective coming from Keynes that predates the notion of national policies that are completely geared towards employing people in large infrastructure projects for the nation. So Berman writes in his book that the new Parisian boulevard was the most spectacular urban innovation of the 19th century and the decisive breakthrough in the modernization of the traditional city. He's absolutely not exaggerating. And in fact, if you think about it, it's in precisely one of these boulevards that the encounter that Baudelaire is talking about, in a sense, actually occurs. But the boulevards also generated a set of contradictions. They pushed the working class and the poor to the northern and eastern peripheries of Paris. By Haussmann's own estimate, about 400,000 people were displaced by the boulevards, and this is the guy who engaged in the exercise himself. These peripheries become miserable places, in fact, the territory of rag packers, of gypsies, and of starving workers. This, in fact, was the Paris also of Victor Hugo, who writes this beautiful novel, Les Miserables, in 1862, literally capturing what is happening to all of these people. Terrible times. This is one of his novels, and here's one description that comes from it. A recent immigrant from Lorraine rents, with his wife and 2 children, 2 minuscule rooms in Belleville, towards the periphery of Paris. He leaves every morning at 5 o'clock, armed with a crust of bread, and walks 4 miles to the center, where he works 15 hours a day in a button factory. After the rent is paid, his regular wages leave him 1 franc a day, about enough to buy only 1 loaf of bread, end quote. Again, comes from the novel, but the novels in this case are actually capturing a very specific reality. What is interesting about the boulevards is that while they deepened the plight of the Parisian poor, they also brought the bourgeoisie, in this case, face to face with poverty. For the first time, and that's why you have this angst on Baudelaire's feeling, you know, why am I enjoying my wine and my food, and these people are just simply barely looking at me? The only thing that they can enjoy is to look at me, and not is anything that I actually have. So the paradox of the boulevard is that what makes them so modern, and I think this is essential to my argument, is that they were meant to separate and segregate and control, but they ended up serving precisely the opposite purpose. As in, they created encounters that were never really designed or meant to happen. So they concentrate the poor in the periphery, while they broke up the dense slums and the congested center of Paris. They also resegregated the poor in the new suburbs. Hence, the shortage of space forced social life into the cafes, into the street, and in a sense, these places, the cafes, become the new hotbeds, if you will, of political agitation. So while you were trying to prevent something by carving the new boulevards so that you can bring the army in, well, guess what? You just simply decentralized it in all of these places in which now people can get together and engage precisely in this kind of discourse. Now, in talking about what happened in Paris, and this is actually an illustration of Haussmann and how he was perceived in Paris in one of the magazines. The communards, the communists who established the Paris Commune, were eventually defeated but the boulevards themselves created new spatial dynamic that was completely irresistible even to them. This was the class encounter that I just talked about that occurred in Baudelaire's time. Haussmannization, a term that then is adopted in planning, whenever it is that you have this notion of cutting through the streets, Haussmannize or Osmanize. It's actually Osmanize in French and Haussmannize in English because we still have the H. Haussmannization had rather the unintended consequence of opening the city and forcing its inhabitants to encounter each other. Berman signifies such class encounter as what he calls inherently modern because they constitute, and I'm going to use his term here, paradoxical unity. It is the glitter of the boulevard cafes that lights up the rubble of displacement and brings to view, if you will, the eyes of the poor. And again, all of these encounters, if you will, reveal the cracks and the fractures of European society at the time. The ruling classes of the reactionary 1850s had told the world that all is solid again, you know, because of French Revolution, you know, the world is undergoing massive change, and no, now everything has sort of cleared down. It is solid again, even if they themselves did not necessarily believe it. In this prose poem, Baudelaire actually captures this moment of uncertainty, of tremendous hope, and equally wrenching anguish. Berman actually quotes Marx in characterizing this sense of modernity, which is the reason that Berman gives that interesting title to the book. That's what he says. He says, all fixed, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy becomes profane. And men at last are forced to face the real conditions of their lives and their relationship with fellow men. End quote. These are definitely the contradictions of urbanism within the modern time. What Baudelaire's family of eyes becomes so compelling, in a sense, is that it is a manifestation of a class division in the modern city that opens up new divisions within the modern self itself. It divides lovers, it wrenches the soul, it shows how modern encounters leave a deep wound in the intimate, the most intimate, if you will, of emotions. Now, I want to be able to contrast that because not every single place is the same. By the way, this is the cover of the book, and here I'm actually just showing you a photograph of Karl Marx because, again, the title of the book is inspired from a Marxist statement. Well, in that book, there's another chapter which I like very much, and I think it's very relevant to also talk about because it captures a different reality of urbanism. It's a chapter that Berman has on St. Petersburg in Russia. And you're actually looking at St. Petersburg in Russia here. The Russian counterpart to the Parisian boulevard in the late 19th century was a major street, another boulevard, if you will, in St. Petersburg, which for a very long time was actually called Leningrad, between 1919 and 1992. It was called Leningrad, called the Nevsky Prospect. Nevsky Prospect, the prospect is a boulevard, Nevsky is its name. One of the three main important radial streets, if you will, in the city. In the 1860s, as Baudelaire was actually writing about the streets of Paris, so were Russian writers were also engaging in writing about, St. Petersburg itself. Their imagination was very much particularly fired, I would say, by the possibilities of the time. In 1861, Alexander II, who was the Tsar of Russia, declared the emancipation of the serfs. 1861, the emancipation of the serfs. You have to put that, again, in the larger context of what's going on in the world. This is also the time in which the Civil War occurred in the United States around the emancipation of the slaves. So Russia has its own slaves. They're not slaves, but it's like you work in a field, you work for a nobleman, you're a slave. You're not owned, but you're a slave. In the United States, you were a slave. Someone else had the certificate of ownership of you. So changes are occurring in the entire world. Very difficult to see modernity without taking all of these changes into account. So in 1860s, Alexander II declares the emancipation of the serfs, and in the process, about 1/3 of the Russian population is freed from the notion of working the land. They can move around. They don't need permission anymore. This was also the period in Russia and in other parts of Europe that saw the rise of socialist elements, as I said earlier, all the way extending from France all the way to Russia. In fact, it was very important that Alexander II himself was assassinated in 1880 as a result of the decision to free the serfs, just like Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in the United States 20 years earlier as a result of freeing the slaves. So these are global patterns that occur in one place but definitely influence another. Perhaps the first famous confrontation that actually occurred in the 1860s was written by a guy called Chernyshevsky in 1863. A very interesting novel which was actually called What Is to Be Done. The same name that was later adopted by the communists in making the Russian Revolution in 1917. What Is to Be Done? A title that was definitely later appropriated by Lenin. Chernyshevsky's book, written in the 1860s, was about what he called the new people. What were the new people to him? The modern people. What are these modern people? They were the clerks, the low-ranking military officers, all of whom he saw as the potential reworking of the hierarchy of Russian society that basically had nobility in it and was not at all different from what had existed in the Middle Ages. So this is the fundamental change that brings about this notion of the modern. In response to what is to be done, Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist, writes this beautiful novel called Notes from the Underground. And Notes from the Underground is about one of these poor clerks who happen to work in government. The clerk passes a tavern and hears and sees commotions in it. Some men are fighting, and the scene arouses in him a desire to fight. He confronts the aggressor, a 6-foot-tall officer, who simply, without saying a word, picks him up by the shoulders and moves him away, and in a sense just totally ignores him. In that novel, the clerk, who comes from the lower classes, is insulted, but he feels there's nothing he can do about it. So in the entire novel is about his imagining how he's going to stand up to this authority. And this authority just happens to be simply a military officer of a higher rank, who also comes from the nobility. So he plans, the entire novel is about his planning that confrontation. He is going to walk the streets, the Nevsky, and he is going to hit the Nevsky, he's going to hit that officer on the Nevsky in a way to sort of take revenge, if you will. The day comes when he finally is going to engage in this exercise. And unfortunately, as he comes very close to the officer, he trips and falls in front. And instead of being able to punch the officer in his face, the officer, who does not even recognize him, puts his hand and picks him up and helps him to stand. And hence, he is sort of left with the feeling of the tremendous powerlessness, if you will. Berman talks about this as the angst of the middle class within the modern city, which doesn't allow them to ever exceed, if you will, their own limitations. So, of course, I can ask a question, which is, how is this similar and or different than Eyes of the Poor in Paris? Well, it's very different. It is similar only in the similarity of space, that the Nevsky was actually created as a street in the same way that the Champs-Élysées was actually created in Paris as a boulevard. But in one encounter, it is almost about guilt. But the other encounter is about the inability to exceed one's status. If we contrast actually both, we also have to look into how is it that both of these places came into existence. So, in the case of St. Petersburg, Peter I began actually building St. Petersburg back in 1700, so way before Baron Osman or Napoleon II acted on Paris. He insisted on establishing Russia's capital in this very specific location. Why? Because it was the closest site that he could have to Europe. Why? Because the Russians, back then and even until today, have this inferiority complex that they have always been dismissed by the rest of Europe as Orientalists. Believe it or not, for a very long period of time, Russians were just put with the rest of us. They were not European, even though a considerable part of Russia is in Europe. A much larger part, of course, is in Asia. So for Peter the Great, Peter the First, who's Peter the Great, that was a very important part, or point. He wanted to leave Moscow, move the capital over there, even though the site of St. Petersburg is one of the worst sites to put a city ever. Why? It existed on swamps. It is extremely cold in the winter. It is not necessarily very accessible to other parts of Russia, even though it is accessible to Europe itself. And, you know, indeed, very few rulers ever had the power to build on such a vast scale. Within a decade, in fact, Peter the Great managed to have 35,000 buildings built in the midst of this swamp. And within 2 decades, he had as close as 150,000 people move there. Petersburg, which was its original name, had become virtually overnight one of the great metropolises of Europe. Peter commanded every stonemason in the whole Russian Empire to relocate to this new construction. He ordered a large proportion of the noblemen not only to move to the new capital, but also to build palaces there. If you want to exist in my empire, I am requiring you to build something there and to come and move there. And of course, you know, having the approval of the Tsar was very important in this case for you to be able to continue to be both nobility and wealthy. Finally, in the serf society, because that was still serfhood at the time, Peter had total power over infinite labor force. What allowed for the construction of St. Petersburg is the fact that, you know, he had all of these people that within 3 years the new city devoured almost an army that is as close to 150,000 workers, physically wrecked or dead. And the state had to, in fact, reach into the Russian interior to get more. Berman is arguing here that the modernization of places like St. Petersburg is a borrowed modernization, recreated by foreign architects. Why? Because the entire plan of the city was not actually done by Russians, it was done by French, and shaped very often by foreign influences and the desire to be something else than what you are. You should reflect on this statement in terms of what is happening in India or what is happening in other parts of the third world. In a sense, that both of these cities look to the West for inspiration. So, for example, I'll give you another statement that comes from Marx, again, written in 1849. So almost at the same time that Baron Osman started to work on Paris. He says the following. This is Karl Marx, writing at the end of the century. The country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. The country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. And indeed, in Russia, St. Petersburg, known as Leningrad, as I said for a while, has symbolized Western style reform. So many Russian leaders have adopted Western idiom of reform. Lenin in a three-piece suit, forcing peasants' collectivization. Then even later, Gorbachev starting what he called the perestroika, as an assault on the traditions of drinking vodka, so on and so forth. Of course, now Putin, he is the great westernizer, if you will, of Russia. He wants to be Russian, but he also wants to be the westernizer. So Berman makes this provocative argument that despite the apparent similarities, there are fundamental important differences in the encounters that we have seen in both of these novels as they tell us about the modern city, in Family of Eyes and Notes of the Underground Poor. He argues that the Nevsky Prospect spatially resembles a Parisian boulevard with the same imposing vistas and the mingling of classes. But they are part of radically different systems of political economy, one capitalist and the other feudal. For him, the boulevards of Paris represents an emerging capitalist order with some form of democracy. This is, of course, riddled with inequalities, with oppressions of wage worker, the anguish of persistent poverty, the swagger of the bourgeois, but also a space of freedom. While the underground man, as comes out from Dostoevsky, for all of his planning, in this case Peter's planning, The underground man remains invisible. He is a fly constantly making way for everyone else. In making this argument about both of these cities, Berman brings about an extremely important point about cities and citizenship. And that's the point, that cities are not just about cities, they are about citizens. He argues that Western modernism manifested itself in planning and urbanism, that Western cities like Paris are still sites of democracy. He is thus recovering a specifically Western idea of the Latin civitas, cities that are made for citizens. There are some very interesting resonances here, of course, with other theories, specifically with the transition debates that seeks to explain how and why capitalism emerged in Western Europe. Historians like Henri Pirenne, that I showed you a slide of, who writes about medieval cities, have located this transition specifically in the emergence of trading cities later of the Middle Ages, which he actually called islands of freedom that dissolve feudalism. So I want to end this by talking about something else that I think is still a bit relevant here, which is, and I think we're doing okay on time, the Crystal Palace. So let me move to that. Because for me, this is the epitome of modernity. How many of you have heard of the Crystal Palace? Okay, not bad. We have not been able to travel because only our army has been there and our governors have been there, to those places so that they understand why is it that we are wealthy, why is it that we are Great Britain. So the Crystal Palace is this very structure that was built to house the World Exhibition, hailed as a feat of modern engineering involving thousands of small prefabricated parts. The structure in fact combined iron lattice work with uniform sheets of glass, and you're actually looking at two images of it produced from that time. What's very important here is both iron as a structural material and glass as basically the making of windows were totally new, and the combination of the two to create the structure was a major innovation of modernity. But while the Crystal Palace was initially erected in London, a geopolitical mapping of its signification requires, I would say, a more global sweep for us to truly understand it. And I would particularly like to consider its impact as an emblem of modernity in two locations, the same locations that I showed you before. St. Petersburg, Russia, and Paris, although I may also add a bit of New York in the late 19th century as a way to show that. So the Crystal Palace is built in London, but then it travels. Why? Because it can be assembled. This is the first time in history. You have a building, you can disassemble it and reassemble it, and it's huge in size. So it's reassembled in New York specifically, and it's visited by many. So one of the people who visits the Crystal Palace in London when it was first built is the same guy who writes Notes from the Underground, Dostoevsky. Okay, so Dostoevsky writes the following. Remember, he's come from Russia. He comes from St. Petersburg. He is very critical of the inability of the middle class to move on. He understands a very specific modernity, which actually Berman talks about as the modernity of underdevelopment. Why? Because it's still based on feudalism. So he writes the following. He said, "You believe in a crystal edifice that can never be destroyed, an edifice at which one would not be able to sting one's tongue out on the sly. And I'm afraid of this edifice because it is of crystal and can never be destroyed, and because one could not stick out one's tongue on it at the sly." Berman sees this rejection by Dostoevsky as part of this modernism of underdevelopment, arguing that Dostoevsky looked at the Crystal Palace as a backward Russian. If the palace symbolized Western materialism and progress, it also symbolized Russian fantasies of replicating this Western idea. And Dostoevsky particularly found this unbearable. Implicit in Berman's discussion of modernity is this dualism between development and underdevelopment. You see, none of the terms that I used are unrelated. They're all related. Development is related to modernity, is related to planning. So implicit in Berman's argument or discussion of modernity is this dualism between development and underdevelopment, between the West and the Orient, between democracy and authoritarianism. This designates the late 19th century Paris as the democratic ideal of development, whether that was right or wrong, the broad and open way. And this ideal is made possible through the contrast to what is happening, if you will, in Russia. But if you read Dostoevsky carefully, you'll find that his words were much more than Oriental envy. They were prescient. Dostoevsky immediately recognizes the Crystal Palace as an early attempt at worldwide commerce. He rejects the symbolic order of the world exhibition in what he actually talks about as this biblical scene. He sees this thing, he sees objects that are taken from ancient Egypt and ancient India and ancient China are now available to everybody. And, he almost understands, like, this is the end of the world. This ultimate truth. You sense that it would require a great deal of eternal spiritual fortitude and denial in order not to submit to it, he says. Not to yield to the impression, not to bow down to the fact, not to worship, not to accept the world that exists as one's own ideal, end quote. And one of the very interesting things here is that then you have another famous poet, Walt Whitman, in the United States, and he visits the Crystal Palace when it moves to New York. But then he has a totally different reaction to it altogether. Because Whitman, in this case, has the arrogance of an American upstart nation. He doesn't have the complexities that come from feudalism in Russia and the emancipation of the serfs, so on and so forth. So he simply makes the statement, which is an extremely arrogant one. He writes in a poem, "Encompass world, but never try to encompass me. I can crowd your noisiest talk by simply looking towards you." He's talking to the exhibition. And he's talking to the exhibition from that very specific perspective of power. And actually, I'm going to end here because I know that I already exceeded my time, and because I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions if we are okay with time. What do you think? Are we okay with time? Okay, that's fantastic. Can we get the lights on, please? I would actually like to show you, can I show one of the videos for now? Yes, since we have the time, I'm going to actually do that, and then maybe we can have some of the discussions later. Can you come and adjust the sound for me, please? So here, I'm going to do this. So this is just one way of the 19th century. I didn't move yet to the 20th century. And the 20th century, of course, offers a different kind of modernity that I've written extensively about, which is what I call cynical modernity. It's the modernity that has come from excessive planning interventions. Yes, I think that this is going to be good. Let's see if this will work. So I've chosen a number of clips, some of which I will show now, some of which I will show maybe later this afternoon if you're interested. They come from two films by a very famous French director who has spent he only did 7 films. His name is Jacques Tati. Tati was very interested in modernity, but he was also interested in the city. So his films, he is the main character. He's always the main character in the films. He never says a word in the films. He just goes around exploring the city, sometimes exploring a house. So he did 2 films. One is called Mon Oncle, and it's about the transformations that occur in Paris from the old city to the new city and the building of the suburbs. And he is the flaneur. He is Baudelaire, but in this case, in the 1960s, in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, and even early 70s. His last film was late 70s. Then he has another film called Playtime. But Playtime is no longer just about the city now. It is about the city as it exists within the business districts and as it exists within the interaction, if you will, between people at work. So I'm going to show you a few clips. Each is like maybe 1 or 2 minutes, but it may be worth it. Yes.
Je pensais tout près, je suis dit... Ce n'est pas possible, il faut que je m'arrête pour savoir ce qu'il devient. Votre visite, on ne vous voit jamais. Oh, ça pour une surprise. Je ne voulais pas vous déranger, je vous avais en plein travaux. Le jardin est à peine terminé. En effet, je vois. Mais c'est que tout ça a pris du... Oh, vous voyez, ça commence à prendre tournure. Alors le hall, vous connaissiez. Bravo, bravo. Oh, c'est si pratique, tout communique. Voilà, c'est ça. Ici, le living room. Oh, vous savez, c'est très simple. Et alors, vous voyez ici, la chambre de Gérard. Comme vous le voyez, tout communique. Là, notre coin. Du broc. Ah oui, nous avons l'air conditionné partout. Et il faut que je vous dise, tous les plans ont été dessinés à l'usine de mon mari. Oh, mais c'est original. On peut s'asseoir. Je vous en prie, c'est fait pour ça. Oh, mon steak. Bon, alors, 2, 4... Reculez-vous un peu. C'est pour le jus. Tiens, Charles, regarde. C'est bien simple. Sa maison est mieux tenue que la nôtre.
Oh.
Si, je le reconnais.
c'est bon, c'est fini, oui.
The idea of the World Exhibition initially was that you would collect a lot of objects, and many of these objects, and I'm actually going to talk a bit about that in my lecture on colonialism, which comes next. These objects are then given or put on display for people to see. Initially, the Crystal Palace was in a sense made for the subjects of the British Empire, to show people how great things are. But the idea of the exposition then spreads, and the people much more interested in it are the Americans and the French. The French are interested because they're always competing with the British. The Americans are interested because it's sort of the new nation that is coming in. So what happens is, once the Crystal Palace got disassembled, and it's really unfortunate it got disassembled, the same did not happen with the Paris Exposition of 1867. Because today, if you visit Paris and you visit a place called Parc de la Villette, you actually find in that area some of the structures that were designed for that exposition. They were kept, like the Great Hall of the Machinery, for example. With regard to the Crystal Palace, once it got disassembled, much of the iron, cast iron, that was used was actually recast and used for other things. But some elements of it stayed. So a small component of it was shipped to America and was reassembled in New York and was used as an exposition before the United States hosted its first real exposition, which does not really happen until Chicago at the end of the century. And then after Chicago, at the end of the century, another one actually happens in San Francisco. So you have what was called the Columbian Exposition of Chicago in, I think, 1898. And then you have the Pacific Panama Exposition, which happens in San Francisco after the earthquake, so it must have been 1912. And the idea of the exposition continues to happen until today, but it doesn't happen with the same fanfare that it used to happen way back then. Now it's actually been replaced, I would argue, by the idea of either the World Cup or the modern Olympics. So it's no longer about displaying what you own, because the colonial empires don't own anything anymore, but it's who you are and where you can win, if you will.
So, why the idea of exposition shifted from England of Crystal Palace, then all the next 4 or 5 in Paris?
Well, it's not that it shifted, it's the fact that you always have to see these things in the historical context of what is going on in those countries, but also in the globe. So France, in the latter part of the 19th century, from 1867, because Paris has 3 expositions. So in the latter part, France is in, unlike the United Kingdom, which is very stable politically, so on and so forth, the Victorian age is coming to an end, and France is still undergoing major change. And that major change is bringing about the desire to explore. They want to continue to be an empire, but at the same time there's a great deal of self-examination that the British did not engage in. And in a sense, the expositions have done that to France. In fact, the expositions have, I would argue, become part of France's identity in a way that never happened in England. Never happened.
So, to my understanding, I think Belgium was the first country to get industrialization, the fastest.
Which country? Belgium?
Belgium.
Yeah, but you also have to recognize that most of these countries were always undergoing changes of territory. So Belgium was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for a very long time. And in a sense, industrialization at the level of the nation is very difficult than industrialization at the level of the city. I would argue that what is more important to us in planning is to understand how industrialization impacted cities as opposed to impacted nations altogether.
And so why no more expositions after 1889 in Europe?
Yes, because the countries of the Third World and the countries of the Eastern world and of the Orient decided that they are the ones that want to showcase themselves to the rest of the world. The final exposition that actually occurred in the United States, if you can talk about as an exposition, is the one that occurred in New York in 1960. And then, of course, the one that occurred in Tokyo in 1964. I would actually consider these the last of the expositions. Now they still happen, but they mean different things. They don't have the same level of enthusiasm, they don't have the same level of government funding, they don't have the same level of participation of nations, and indeed what they end up with is sort of
experimentation.
Yeah, they become places where corporations actually, the only place where nations compete, but it's no longer nations, if you will, it's architects who represent nations, is in something like the Venice Biennale or the Balkan Biennale. And for me, these are not actually meaningful at all. In fact, sometimes they're even laughable. But I think it's time to take a break and we'll come back for more.
Yes, it's time for tea, definitely. And we'll reassemble here in 20 minutes, I guess.
That's
so,
fine.
Yeah. So by 12, 10, and latest by 15, please be here.
कटेगा ही मैडम सुना तो नहीं
कल मैंने जाना था ना सर